If you haven't read up on the Russian Revolution and Russian Civil War, you may not have heard of the White Movement and White Army, nor the Russian Liberation Army. Basically, the White Movement and its combined arms, known as the White Army, stood in opposition to the Bolsheviks in the Revolution and Civil War, and after the Bolsheviks took root and established the Soviet Union, many former members of the White Movement and Army formed smaller anti-Soviet organizations such as the Liberation Army. Along with many other anti-Soviet forces, the Liberation Army force fought against the USSR in the Second World War, mostly under Nazi flags. In this video, we'll discuss this in greater detail. So, before we discuss the Whites, just what was this revolution? The Russian Revolution was a period of social and political upheaval in what was then the Russian Empire, and the Russian Civil War was the violent conflict which ensued. In 1917, the final year of the Great War, two marked revolutions occurred, one in February and the other in October. In the February Revolution, Russians massed in the capital city Petrograd, now St. Petersburg, and protected the Russian monarchy, inciting Tsar Nicholas II to abdicate and ending the Romanov dynasty and Russian Empire. In the monarch's place, a provisional government was established. As this government favored aristocracy and capitalism, the soldiers and working class weren't satisfied, and they stirred unrest in a network of socialist political organizations known as Soviets. One of such organizations were the Bolsheviks, which was spearheaded by Vladimir Ilyich Ulyanov, or Lenin, a revolutionist who fought to pull Russia out of the Great War. After the provisional government chose to keep fighting the war against Lenin's behest, the Bolsheviks transformed their workers' militias into a paramilitary volunteer force known as the Red Guards, and later the Red Army. And in October 1917, they overthrew the provisional government and pulled Russia out of World War I with the signing of the Russo-German Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. The Bolsheviks enforced their rule with violence, and this incited counter-revolutionary organizations to step up. There were many such organizations, each with varying political stances. Some favored monarchism, others republicanism, liberalism, capitalism, alternative forms of socialism, and a range of other isms. But most of them fed into the stream of the Big Tent White Movement and its army, which was reinforced by Bolshevik-fearing foreign nations, including the Allied forces of the now ended Great War. The civil war which ensued resulted in the defeat of the Whites by the Reds and the maturation of Bolshevism in the form of the Soviet Union, and by 1923, between 7 and 12 million people had become casualties of this devastating revolution. So, who exactly were the Whites? What did they want and what happened to them? Well, it's important to understand that the White Movement was first and foremost a political movement without unified leadership. Basically, anyone who wanted to shut down Soviet and Bolshevik organizations and return some semblance of order to Russia was for the Whites. But this doesn't mean to say that the Whites were leaderless and entirely scattered. Each of its constituent political organizations had its own form of leadership, cooperating with one another and foreign nations to varying degrees, and leadership within the White Movement's various forces was often assumed by former military personnel and, thus, reasonably strong. Its major military forces were the Volunteer Army and the Siberian Army, though other forces, such as the Northern Army and the Northwestern Army, the West Russian Volunteer Army, and the People's Army of Komuch, also fought under the loose banner of the White Army in the various fronts of the Russian Civil War. Alliances and leadership changed a fair bit, but in September 1918, after Minister of War Alexander Kolchak was proclaimed the supreme ruler of Russia, most White Army forces united as the Russian Army. Unfortunately, this new army was relatively short-lived. The ASFR, the Russian army's largest constituent, was defeated on the southern front between 1920 and 1922. The White Army in Siberia suffered a similar fate, with Supreme Ruler Kolchak ultimately getting arrested and shot. But these defeats, the dissolution of the Russian army and the Whites' loss in the Civil War, were sort of preordained. Unlike their Red Army counterparts, they didn't share one single ideology nor goal, and unification under the late Supreme Leader was not enough. At its peak in June 1919, it's estimated that the White Army boasted some 680,000 combat personnel. But what happened to the remnant organizations of the White Movement after they were defeated and the Bolsheviks established the Soviet Union? Well, there were hundreds of thousands of them, millions, and many fled Russia and congregated elsewhere in the continent, such as Yugoslavia, Turkey, China, Germany, and France, where new anti-Bolshevik and, more broadly, anti-communist organizations and networks were formed. Some of these military organizations, such as the Russian All-Military Union, the Brotherhood of Russian Truth, and the National Alliance of Russian Soldierists, harried the Soviet Union with guerrilla warfare to little effect, but some more military-minded organizations actually established cadet corps and such to prepare for a larger scale assault, a proper military campaign. With that said, some of the Whites sort of looked at the bright side of the revolution, establishing movements and organizations such as Eurasianism Smenovsky and the Union of Ladorossi, the latter being a group which sought a hybrid system of government, somewhere between a Tsar monarchy and the Soviet Union. But as we said at the start, there were those who fought the USSR under Nazi flags during the Second World War. Some of these people were the volunteers of the Russian Liberation Army. Funnily enough, the Russian Liberation Army, or ROA, was led by a defected Red Army general by the name of Andrei Vlasov, with the force often referred to as the Vlasov Army. While it served the Germans prior to 1944, it wasn't until late that year until it became an official organization, representing the military army of the Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, or KONR, which was comprised of anti-Soviet Nazi collaborators from the states now melded into the USSR. Not all of these people were ex-whites, however. The majority of them were Soviet POWs who joined the army to avoid rotting in German camps. Obviously, the Germans could only trust them so much, so at the start, they were deployed in small units tasked with fighting Soviet partisans and given support duties, such as driving vehicles or removing the wounded from the battlefield. By early 1945, however, the ROA earned some trust, and it was soon under the direct command of the KONR. Of note, some ROA soldiers fought the Red Army by Europe's Oder River on April 1945, but they were ultimately forced to retreat. Then things went south for Germany, and Vlasov was looking to surrender the ROA to the Allies instead of the Red Army. While a division of the ROA was marching towards said surrender, they stopped at Prague and helped Czech partisans fight off their German occupiers. The ROA fought Waffen-SS units in the city alongside the partisans, saving Prague from utter destruction. And after this, Vlasov finally got them to the Allies, only to be met by US General Patton, who accepted their surrender but handed them over to the Soviets anyway. Many members of the ROA, including Vlasov, were executed as traitors back in Russia. Now, the Russian Liberation Army was but one of many anti-Soviet forces which fought alongside Germany against the USSR in World War II. Indeed, there was an entire Russian liberation movement whose numbers were attributed to by many ex-whites. The liberation movement, like the white movement before it, was a loose collective, and the closest it came to formal unification was the aforementioned Committee for the Liberation of the Peoples of Russia, or KONR. With that said, around 1 million people from the states consumed by the USSR followed the movement, fighting alongside the Germans in auxiliary volunteer units known as the Hilfswillige, or Hiwi. While some 50,000 ended up under the banner of Vlasov and his Liberation Army, the majority ended up in forces scattered throughout Europe, with the First Russian National Army, the Russian Protective Corps, and the Russian National Liberation Army, or SS Sturmbrigade Rona, being among the more organized of these forces. One of the few anti-Soviet organizations which didn't seek German sponsorship was the aforementioned National Alliance of Russian Soldarists, or NTS. When deciding with whom they would side, the NTS's leader, Sergei Badylakov, said, "Not with Stalin, not with foreign conquerors, but with the entire Russian people." The NTS, conceived by white movement veterans from the early 1920s, persisted as an underground revolutionary movement until the fall of the USSR in 1991. Overall, both the white movement and the Russian liberation movement were loose movements toward a plethora of similar but by no means identical goals, and without unified, clear goals, they were both predestined to fail. With that said, the Soviet Union ultimately did dissolve, and at least some of the ideologies for which these movements stood, and some of their constituent organizations, such as the NTS, contributed to said dissolution to some degree. Though, as per usual guys, I want to know what you think. Had you heard about the White Army before this video? Did you know about all the different factions of the White Army and how disorganized it was? And which faction of the White Army would you most agree with? Let us know all of this in the comment section below. And just before you go guys, if you want access to the wider community and access to exclusive content that you won't find on this channel, make sure you check us out on Facebook, Instagram, and Discord, the latter of which you can actually talk with other history buffs and myself, and check out some of the video sources too. Anyways guys, as always, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.